Now, the mining industry was a huge employer, and it was dangerous work, and therefore many patients came to the infirmary from the mining industry. By 1938, the North Staffordshire mine owners had come together to produce a scheme whereby there would be the financing of orthopaedic services, particularly for accidents, and this was the beginning of the fracture clinic. Here we see a man who has been brought up in the cage and is now being brought to the ambulance to be taken into the infirmary. He would be better placed now in a relatively modern ambulance than he would have been even a few years ago when they were horse-drawn vehicles. And it has to bump its way through the yard. And carry him out into the streets. As they lift him in, you'll notice there are no paramedics or trained ambulance assistants. The driver will take him along, and he will be accompanied by his friends. The streets at the time are somewhat deserted. The ambulance makes good time up to the entrance to the infirmary, passing through an entrance which isn't used today. On the far side is the big outpatients hall, and it is backing up to the casualty department, which had recently been built at the expense of the Mr. Chew, and the patient is now being received. The porters were very formally dressed. In fact, the head porter was appointed from the Commissionaires Corps of retired soldiers. And the door that we see him coming in is still there, although it's now obstructed, and it has above it the Albert Chew Memorial. This was a new accident unit which was built when the hospital had received a very large bequest from Miss Twyford, which had enabled them to complete their building works. And the department was built as a memorial to Mr. Chew, but Miss Twyford's bequest allowed them then to move the old casualty and make it into Ward 17. They're now taking an X-ray of the patient. You notice how tiny the tube is and how relatively flimsy it is, and the fact that the X-ray apparatus bears little relation to that we see today. X-ray has shown a fracture of the spine, which is being pointed out on the X-ray, and its services were eventually made available to members of the general public. As I say, just about this time there was the new source of funding from the coal owners in North Staffordshire to provide specific treatment for those who had been injured from fractures and from back and chest injuries. Falls of coal, of course, are not uncommon by any means. Massage was fundamentally the use of exercises and what we would now call physiotherapy. They were sometimes even known as remedial gymnasts. The rowing machine is perhaps not as high-tech as the ones we see today, but nonetheless the principle would be the same. And interestingly that they are not in gym kit, but virtually all of them have their shirts on, and many of them have their waistcoats on. Recovery, as we might assume, from a shoulder injury. Faith in riding as a form of exercise, I suspect, dates back a rather long time. The actual mechanism is splendidly fragile, but one does wonder how much good it did and whether the Health and Safety Department would be entirely content with it today. Again, the electrical department had a very honourable length of history, dating back to about 1902, when these baths were instituted to pass an electric current through the limb, originally to try to get people to move their arms again after having lead poisoning. And it was from the electrical department, so-called, that the X-ray department had actually also developed. When the hospital was built, it had gas lighting, and the electrical department depended for its first 4 or 5 years on a free supply of electricity which came from the tramway company, which ran a wire across from near Harts Hill Church when the tramway came from Stoke up to Newcastle. It is actually meant to make him better. It looks as if he's about to be electrocuted, but these are attempts to stimulate the muscles and the nerves. Of course, the trouble was that if they'd really had a very severe damage with something like lead poisoning, or if there was severe nerve damage due to an accident, all of this was rather unlikely to be satisfactory, shall we say. These children are receiving sunshine treatment.